So today we've come to a pretty typical Japanese suburb. This place is called Ashiya, located in Kobe, Hyogo Prefecture. Ashiya sits right between Kobe and Osaka, and most people who live here don't actually work here. Instead, they commute to Kobe or Osaka for work. In other words, it's very much a commuter town, filled with residential neighborhoods. In this video, we're going to explore Ashiya, this classic example of a Japanese suburb, and see how it stacks up against the suburbs in the US. Which one sucks more? Let's find out. I'm guessing that many of you watching this video live outside of Japan. So as you watch, think about your own country's suburbs and decide for yourself which suburbs are actually worse. Personally, I've lived in the suburbs of both Australia and Singapore, so I'll be drawing on those experiences too. All right then, let's dive into the reality of suburban life in Japan. First, let's start with a shared understanding. What exactly do we mean by the suburbs? By definition, suburbs are the areas that sit between the city center and the countryside. Unlike the downtown core, which is packed with commercial and administrative functions, suburbs are mostly residential, quieter, and more spacious. At the same time, they're not rural farmland either. They depend heavily on commuting to the city for work and school. From an urban planning perspective, suburbs often function as what's called a bed town, or commuter town. And in Japan, suburbs almost always connected to the city center by trains, buses, or expressways. The growth of suburbs has a clear historical background. They developed as a way to absorb the population overflow from crowded city centers. The world's first suburbs appeared in 19th century London during the Industrial Revolution. As the city center became overcrowded and unsanitary, people began moving outward. The rise of railways and horse-drawn streetcars made suburban housing possible, leading to the development of Metroland, the suburban areas along the Metropolitan Railway. Around the same time, in late 19th century America, trains and streetcars made it possible for people to own single-family homes with gardens further outside the city. Early examples include Riverdale in New York and the suburbs around Boston. Today, you might think of Long Island near New York or Evanston outside Chicago. In the UK, areas like Croydon and Richmond are well-known examples. And here in Japan, Ashiya, where we are now, or Denen-chofu in Tokyo, famous for its upscale residential neighborhoods, are classic suburbs. So suburbs aren't just a byproduct of urban growth. They were intentionally developed to prevent overcrowding in city centers and to spread out the population. That's why all over the world, cities developed a kind of dual structure. People work in the city, but live in the suburbs. To sum it up, suburbs are residential areas on the urban fringe that sit between the city and the countryside, a definition that holds true across the globe. But here's the thing. While the word suburb might sound universal, what suburbs actually look and feel like can be completely different depending on the country. So now, I'd like to take you on a tour of a Japanese suburb, something you probably don't get to see every day, and let's find out how it compares with the suburbs in your own country. The way I came to Ashiya today wasn't by car, it was by train. And that brings us to the first key point. Japanese suburbs are completely rail dependent. In other words, suburbs here are built around train stations. Ashiya is no exception. It grew and developed around Ashiya Station. Historically in Japan, railway companies followed a very unique business model. First, they laid down the tracks, then developed the land along the line, sold it as residential housing, and secured passengers once people moved in. On top of that, these companies often built entire communities, adding department stores, supermarkets, shopping centers, amusement parks, and even schools right next to their stations. Take Ashiya, for example. It's served by 3 different railway lines: the JR Kobe line, the Hankyu Kobe line, and the Hanshin Main Line. Each of these lines belongs to a completely different company, and each one developed residential areas around its own stations. Over time, Ashiya became a major transportation hub. But unlike Denen-chofu in Tokyo, a suburb that was almost entirely master-planned by a railway company, Ashiya's development was shaped by its unique geography, sandwiched between the mountains and the sea, combined with the expanding rail network.
The result is that in Japan, suburbs are essentially station-centered communities. Why? Because everything you need is right there in front of the station. Speaking from experience, I also live in a Japanese suburb, and I can tell you, if I go to the station area, I'll find supermarkets, dollar stores, hair salons, basically all the everyday services I need. There's no reason to drive for hours just to shop. As you can see here in front of Ashiya Station, people live within walking or biking distance, and while having a car is convenient, it's far from essential. Thanks to the extensive railway system, people can cut the costs of owning a car and live a more eco-friendly lifestyle. Back in the day, owning a car in Japan, just like in America, was seen as a symbol of middle-class life, financial security, and freedom. But now, with such a well-developed public transit system, taking the train is simply way cheaper. On top of that, in places like Ashiya, which is close to Osaka, or the suburbs of Tokyo, car ownership comes with insanely high parking fees and maintenance costs. It's just not worth it. Of course, in smaller regional cities in Japan where public transit isn't as developed, cars are a necessity. But in suburbs like Ashiya, right next to a major city, you really don't need one.
Next, let's take a look at the housing you'll find in the suburbs. One of the defining features of Japanese suburban housing is how compact it is. You'll see a lot of small single-family homes and apartment complexes. And the reason is simple. About 70% of Japan's land is mountainous, which means space for people to actually live is very limited. I often say that Japan and Australia face similar geographic constraints, but Japan has had to figure out how to use its limited land far more efficiently. Of course, Australia has much more usable land overall, which puts it in a better position. Now, Japan does have plenty of detached houses in the suburbs, but the average floor space is about 100 to 120 square meters. Compare that to the US or Australia, where the average is closer to 200 to 250 square meters, about double. The difference comes down to land prices. In Japan's metropolitan areas, land is so expensive that most of the money goes toward buying the plot itself. Even if you spend the same amount as you would overseas, the actual house ends up being smaller. But perhaps the real symbol of Japan's suburbs isn't the detached house. It's the apartment, or mansion as it's called here. Around almost every suburban station, you'll find clusters of apartment buildings. There are a few reasons for this. First, Japan's big cities are built around railways, and commuting by train is the norm. For people working in the city, the idea of living within walking distance of a station is extremely attractive. Second, because land near stations is so expensive, it's basically impossible to build single-family homes there. Stacking housing vertically in the form of apartments becomes the logical solution. And finally, there's history. Railway companies deliberately concentrated both housing and commerce around stations when they developed their lines. Even today, if you browse Japanese real estate websites, one of the first things you'll see is how many minutes it takes to walk to the nearest station. Proximity to a station is Japan's suburban landscape. It just makes sense. Now, let's talk about life in these suburbs. They're designed entirely around commuting. People spend their days at school or work in the city, then return home by train in the evening. For everyday shopping, it's common to just stop by a supermarket or convenience store within walking distance, buying small amounts frequently. For example, I'll just grab some milk on the way home is totally normal here. In contrast, in American suburbs, shopping usually means driving to Walmart or Costco on the weekend and stocking up. In Japan, it's more about picking up little things as needed. I even remember when I was a kid, if we ran out of eggs, my mom would just tell me to hop on my bike and go buy some from the local supermarket. And finally, let's touch on community. In the past, Japan had tight-knit neighborhood associations called chonakai, but those are quickly fading away in the suburbs. Personally, I've never joined one, and honestly, you don't really need to. You might have this image of Japanese neighborhoods where people are constantly involved in each other's lives, but that's mostly true in rural areas. In suburban areas around major cities, it's completely normal to not have much interaction with your neighbors. For most people, the suburbs are simply a place to sleep after work. It's where you live, but not necessarily where your community is.
Next, let's take a look at the characteristics of American suburbs. Now, I'm sure many of you watching are far more familiar with how US suburbs actually work, so I'll just go over the basics here. For context, I used to live in the suburbs of Australia, and honestly, I think Australian suburbs are much closer in style to the American model. So let's keep that in mind as we compare. The most striking difference from Japan is that American suburbs are designed in a way that makes life almost impossible without a car. Residential areas, shopping centers, schools, and workplaces are all spread far apart. Public buses are infrequent, and train lines barely exist in most places. Of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, suburban life in the US revolves around driving. That's why houses almost always come with a driveway or a garage. In Japan, massive garages and parking lots are rare, except with luxury homes. So when I first moved to Australia and saw that nearly every suburban house had one, I remember thinking, wait, does that mean every house here is a luxury house? But no, that's just the norm in a car-centered suburb. Housing itself is also very different. Unlike Japan, where apartments dominate near stations, American suburbs are overwhelmingly made up of single-family homes. The lots are wide and the houses are huge. And it makes sense. Americans and Australians are physically bigger than Japanese people, so naturally the standard suburban home is much larger. Shopping is also completely car-oriented. Big box stores and malls are usually located along major highways, with Walmart or Costco offering warehouse-sized stores and parking for hundreds of cars. Many suburban malls are even built right next to highway interchanges so they can draw people from across the region. You don't really see supermarkets nestled inside residential areas like in Japan. In the US, almost everyone drives to do their shopping. And it's not daily shopping like in Japan either. It's usually once or twice a week, buying in bulk, gallons of milk, loaves of bread, big packs of meat and vegetables. Compared to Japan, where people buy small amounts of fresh food every day, the lifestyle is completely different. Personally, I love the Japanese style, grabbing a can of beer from the convenience store by the station and drinking it on my way home. That's something you definitely can't do in the US suburbs. Another key point is the cultural meaning of suburbs in America. They became a symbol of the middle class, especially after World War II. The famous Levittown developments are perhaps the best-known example, mass-produced suburban housing that came to define the classic American suburb. When Japanese people imagine the typical American lifestyle, we usually picture something like this: owning a car, living in a spacious house, enjoying family life and comfort. That's the American dream as seen from abroad. But the big question is, does that dream still hold true today?
Now, as someone who genuinely likes both Japan and overseas life, I don't really want to take sides. But if you ask me, where would you rather live? Honestly, I'd probably say the Japanese suburbs. And I don't say that out of modesty as a Japanese person. As we've seen here in Asia, suburbs around Japan's major cities are incredibly convenient thanks to the extensive rail and public transit networks. It's easy to get into the city, and right in front of the station, you'll usually find shopping streets, supermarkets, and all the essentials. You can live your entire daily life just by walking or biking. On weekends, you can casually head out and find things like internet cafes or karaoke, so it's easy to kill a day without going far. And because owning a car isn't necessary, even students and the elderly can live comfortably. In fact, it's common in Japan for students to rent apartments in the suburbs, or for older people to move from the countryside into station-side condos for the convenience. But of course, it's not all perfect. The biggest downside? The hell of the morning rush hour. Every weekday morning, trains heading from the suburbs into the city turn into human sardine cans. There are countless times I've thought, man, if I could just drive to work, life would be so much easier. And Tokyo's rush hour trains are practically world famous. Being crammed inside, shoulder to shoulder, feeling like just another cog in the machine, it really does feel like daily torture.
So then, what about the suburbs in America? When I lived in the suburbs of Australia, which are quite similar to American suburbs, the first thing I realized was having a big house feels amazing. Living in a cramped apartment can sometimes feel depressing, so in that sense, a spacious home definitely lifts your mood. Plus, suburban neighborhoods in places like Australia or the US are generally quiet and safe, especially for raising kids. That's a big advantage. In Japan, even in the suburbs, you often have cars speeding down narrow streets, which can feel pretty dangerous. But, from my perspective as a Japanese person who actually lived in a foreign suburb, the biggest downside was simple. Life doesn't work without a car. In Japan, you can live entirely within the suburbs without ever owning a car, and it's easy. But in the US, that's just not possible. Cars are expensive to buy, costly to maintain, and once you're dependent on one, your whole city is designed around driving. That means fewer walkable cafes, parks, or shops nearby. And in today's world, where walkable cities are seen as the ideal, that reliance on cars adds a huge burden to everyday life. And then there's the American dream, the idea that every middle-class family could own a home in the suburbs. That dream feels pretty outdated now. Housing prices have skyrocketed, mortgages are harder to manage, and young people can't afford single-family homes the way they used to. For example, the median price of a new home in the U.S. today is about $459,826. With a 30-year mortgage at 6.5%, you'd need an annual household income of around $141,366. But here's the kicker. About 75% of American households don't make enough to qualify. On top of that, home ownership among people aged 35 to 44, aside from the highest earners, has dropped significantly since 1980. So it really does seem like the American dream has lost its shine. That being said, about 55% of Americans still live in the suburbs or in small to mid-sized metropolitan counties. With city center rents being unaffordable, the suburbs are still the default choice for many middle-class and child-raising families. But the question is that because people want the suburbs or because they have no choice? For younger generations and the middle class, it's a tough situation. Suburban homes keep getting more expensive, gas and car costs keep rising, while rents in the city are already sky-high. In Japan, too, housing prices in major metropolitan areas like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya have been going up recently. But compared to the US or Europe, Japanese suburbs are still relatively affordable. In fact, students can still rent small apartments in suburban areas without too much trouble. Of course, that affordability is partly because Japan's population is shrinking, which has kept suburban land prices flat or even declining. So it's a double-edged sword. So there you have it. Today we explored Ashiya, a typical Japanese suburb, and compared it to the suburban lifestyle in America. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Would you rather live in the suburbs of Japan or in the suburbs of America? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.